Thanks, Manoj. Great introduction. So normally what I do when I start these talks is to sort of share a little bit about me. And I know you already heard a great introduction, or at least it sounded great. But let me tell you a little bit about myself first, and then we'll get into the talk. So I was born and raised in Montreal, Canada, so the Great White North. I graduated in computer engineering from McGill University, as mentioned. Started getting into software. I actually wanted to get into hardware first, but there was a recession at that time when I graduated, and fortunately I got a job in software at Nortel, or actually Bell Northern Research, up in Ottawa, Canada. People are recognizing that name. Nortel's no longer here, of course, but so that brings me to the next part of the story. When I was in telecom, I actually worked in telecom for maybe 5 years up in Canada. I thought, you know, where's all the telecommunication happening? Where's the action going on? And it was here at the time. It was Dallas, Texas, with the telecom corridor. And so I moved my family here to Dallas back in very late 1995, just after Christmas. So 1996, I started working for a company that's just up the road. They're actually no longer there. It was called Digital Switching Corporation, DSC. So I started working in PB1 and PB3 and those types of buildings. And then later, of course, it was bought out by Alcatel. So Alcatel's still around, and they're great. But I was working on a project back in year 2000 that lasted a couple years called Call Server. And we started off, we were about 300 people, and as time went on, by the end of it, we were 10 left. Like, they were just reducing the project and laying us off. And so I started looking for a job at that time I knew was going to be laid off back in late 2002, and I found Digital Defense. And interviewed, and they brought me on board to help design the next iteration. They kind of had a very, very immature vulnerability management system at the time, which I would call a two-tier system, two-tier architected system. So I came on board, led a very small team to re-architect that. We stood it up. So I started in November 2002. We stood up the system in early 2004. There was 4 people on the project, 4 developers, like a tiger team. And, it's still running. We're in our 6th iteration right now. So I work for Digital Defense. So I'm in San Antonio now, by the way. I thought I would only stay there 1 year because I really love Dallas, but I'm still there. I love the company, and San Antonio grew on me. So, and there's the Spurs, etc. So, it's great. Anyway, I work for Digital Defense. What do? We do vulnerability management, we do penetration testing, and we do security awareness training. So quick commercial, security awareness training, we're in the Gartner Magic Quadrant. We teamed up with an award-winning, an Emmy award-winning Saturday Night Live writer to come up with some comedy skits and make security awareness training really cool and fun and interesting. So that's part of what we do, but that's, I would say, the least that we do. We actually started out doing penetration testing back in 1998, 1999, and thought, hey, we're making a lot of money at this, but how could we more automate this? And that's where we came up with vulnerability management. And that brings us to vulnerability management, which is our bread and butter solution. Like I say, we're on our 6th iteration. We are cloud-based or SaaS-based. At the time when we stood it up, it wasn't really called SaaS-based. It was something else, but buzzwords change across time. So we're a SaaS-based solution. We do external vulnerability assessments, internal vulnerability assessments, but more so we do vulnerability management. So it's not just about scanning. And that's what this talk is about. I want to say back in 2005, we landed a very large client. So we started out in financial institutions and grew into technology, et cetera. And then back in 2005, actually 2004, we landed a very large software company, and they were more mature, I would say, than our other clients as far as the process is concerned, but they needed a lot of help and they experienced a lot of challenges. And so we started, because we didn't want to lose them, and we had other big competitors, we actually started giving away, you could say, for free, a managed service. We didn't call it a managed service at the time, but we would do lots of things for them, and they were extremely satisfied, and they told us, you should sell this. You should sell this offering. So we do the technology, we develop our own technology, but we also supplement that with what's called a managed service. And we've learned across time quite a bit about vulnerability management, and that's what this talks about. And specifically, it's about vulnerability management maturity model, the maturity model that we came up with, and we call it VM cubed or VM3. And so that's what this talks about. So we're going to go over what vulnerability management is, and there's many different ways to look at it. So we kind of structured it in a certain way for communicating what it's about. I'm going to talk a little bit about not just how vulnerability management has evolved, but how we have evolved in our thinking. So I call that inside the CISO's mind. We'll talk about vulnerability management challenges, and it's a lot of people when they hear about vulnerability management, first they think assessments, and they really think about scanning, and certainly there's challenges there, and there's a lot of technical challenges, and I love talking about those challenges, and I actually have a specific talk geared towards that, which is called Vulnerability Management Systems Flawed, Leaving Your Enterprise at High Risk, if you've seen it. But that's not what I will talk a little bit about that. So there's some cool stuff here too, but there's some even more cool stuff, which is it's not just the technology, it's the process, and we'll dive into what are those challenges that impede organizations from achieving higher levels of maturity and lower levels of risk. Then we're going to introduce the vulnerability management maturity model, and I'll give you a reference to that study. We're going to look at how you could accelerate your evolution up the scale. How do you become more and more mature with vulnerability management? And finally, we're bringing it all together. Great. Vulnerability management. So let's talk a little bit about vulnerability management and how it's evolved across time. When I first started at Digital Defense years ago, I didn't really know what vulnerability management was either. In fact, I didn't know much about security. I'm a software developer by trade and an architect. But of course, I learned a lot about security. We've got a penetration test team there that basically drinks Red Bull all day and all night, and they hack and stuff, so you can't help but start learning a little bit. But back in the olden days, organizations, by and large, they would perform scanning, and we can call it scanning, very sparingly, like once a year, maybe twice a year. They would they would look at their findings, and those findings would basically represent mountains of data. And then, of course, I say we because all of us in different organizations were overwhelmed with fixing the issues, right? So that's sort of the olden days of vulnerability management. Nowadays, we know it's a process, and so the process includes things like setting policies. What are your policies? How often do you scan? What risk level threshold are you willing to bear? So there's measurements involved, which is sort of at the end of this process. Obviously, a big part of it is discovering your assets throughout your network. I'm talking about network vulnerability assessments. Of course, vulnerability management, you can think also that it would include applications, so source code analysis, etc. So it's not just network vulnerability detection. So discover your assets, discover your applications. The other element of discover that I have up here as a separate element is extremely important. It's discover business value. And a few years ago, I started looking into this, especially when organizations started becoming more and more mature. We were looking at ways to prioritize vulnerabilities within different dimensions. And one of the strong dimensions is if you know where your business value is within your organization, you should use that as a way to sort of prioritize your fixes. So you could imagine an organization that has 100,000 computers, 100,000 hosts with 10 vulnerabilities, just to sort of make it light each. You're talking like millions. It gets up there in terms of vulnerabilities, and you can't possibly solve them all, so you have to prioritize them. And in the olden days, what we would do is we would prioritize based on vulnerability severity, critical level, high level, etc. But even then, we're still overwhelmed. So we have to look at other dimensions. And one of the dimensions is business value. So it's kind of like the analogy I often use is when you have a castle and you have gold in certain rooms of the castle, right, your kingdom, Well, you're going to want to protect those rooms with more resources as compared to those rooms that don't have gold, if that makes sense, right? What are we assessing? We're assessing vulnerabilities, we're assessing configuration, and often we talk about, and a lot of people would disagree with me, assessing people. And we started talking about assessing people as part of vulnerability management, and that's where we came out a few years ago with our security awareness training. And you'll see, lots of security reports coming out that show us and reveal that the attackers are actually using people far more today than what they used to, because people are, we're all vulnerable, right? We can click on links and we're prone to phishing, et cetera. How do we assess? So there's different ways to assess. Within the realm of vulnerability management, we talk about unauthenticated scanning. We talk about authenticated scanning, agent-based scanning. We can talk a little bit about that. There's DAST, which is dynamic assessment security testing, basically web app testing, and SAST, security assessment or static application security testing. Sometimes I look at these acronyms and I'm like, I don't remember what they mean, but I know what they mean. I just don't know what they stand for. That's what that is. We'll talk a little bit about what each of these is as we move forward. Prioritizing the findings, I touched on that a little bit as far as the different dimensions. So vulnerability management, that's a big element within it. That's a big activity. And in order to do that, okay, so once they're prioritized, you want to assign them to your IT staff. That's actually quite a large challenge. Smaller organizations may not see this as a big challenge as much as larger ones. So if you're a small organization and you have 100 computers and you have a small staff, you'll probably know who to assign your vulnerabilities to. You probably know who owns the assets. But if you're an organization like a huge enterprise where you have a centralized security team who's managing the vulnerability technology, the vulnerability scanning technology, but where the asset owners are spread out throughout the enterprise in many different departments, you may not even know who the owner of the asset is. So this is where an integration, for example, with a CMDB, providing the CMDB has that information, might help. But anyway, I digress. The challenge, I guess the point I'm trying to make is that's a big part of vulnerability management as it relates to today. And of course, we talked about measurement a little bit there. Moving forward. So here's a little diagram that's showing what I call a security, an integrated security ecosystem. And this kind of touches on evolution. So years ago, I remember I would go to Gartner conferences, and I still do. And at a certain year, they started talking about the concept of security solutions operating within their own silo. Right, so vulnerability management would operate within its own silo, but it wouldn't necessarily be integrated with intrusion prevention systems or data loss prevention, et cetera. Nowadays, more and more organizations are looking to reduce risk by solving some use cases or different challenging use cases that actually require different types of integrations within these solutions. And of course, SIMs is a natural, you would think SIMs, that's basically wanting to pull data from different sources and correlate them. So that's a very good example, but you don't necessarily need a SIM to integrate. You can do it in different ways. So the point is, this diagram is just showing that nowadays we've evolved away from siloed security and more towards an integrated security ecosystem, and that influences vulnerability management or security maturity in general. Because we have a managed service, or we offer a managed service at Digital Defense, I have the opportunity to interact a lot with a lot of different security professionals. They call me up or I call them, and we talk about different challenges. And so this is basically sharing that our thinking has evolved across time as well, right? So not just technology, it's how we think. And I'm going to give an example about this in a second, but CISOs think in two different ways, I want to say. One is they think as a general, right? And specifically when you're protecting your fortress, You're sort of a defense general. So that's one way. You want to understand where you're vulnerable now, and then take action to reduce that risk. And secondly, we think like a detective. So you can think of the series The Killing. I like that series, it's kind of cool. But anyway, this is where you realize that the present, of course, is important. Where I'm weak today, where I'm vulnerable today is very important. But there are many use cases that require you to look into the past and to correlate that information with the present in a sort of a more detective-oriented way, if that makes sense. And so I'm giving an example here of a use case to sort of drive home this and to sort of set the stage for some more of what's coming up in the presentation. Now, digital defense, actually, we have a vulnerability research team. And I want to say that all vulnerability management vendors do, because we have to come up with new detections all the time as new vulnerabilities emerge. And in combination with our vulnerability research team and our technology, we're able to uncover ZeroDays. We actually just announced a few ZeroDays on EMC just recently, and then a few weeks back we announced some on Dell, which were quite serious and got us a lot of press. That's not the point of my speech here. What I'm sharing is, in this use case, don't go out of this room saying, Gordon just revealed a new ZeroDay on Apache, because that's not what I'm doing. I'm just using a hypothetical situation here. So imagine that you have a situation where you're responsible for your vulnerability management process within your organization. And you just learned this new information that, oh, there's a new ZeroDay on Apache, and I know I have Apache within my organization at different places. The extra piece of the information is that they just recently patched it. So in the most recent version, which is 2.4.23, if I'm still correct, I haven't checked it in the last week or so, it's not vulnerable. But in the previous versions, it is vulnerable. So as a security general, you'd want to know, where am I vulnerable right now? And so the diagrams that I'm showing here are a representation of, so these are two different network diagrams, small network diagrams, which are showing us the red dots represent where you're vulnerable, where you are vulnerable, or where you were vulnerable. So the right-hand side of the diagram is showing us that there are 3 instances that are vulnerable to this ZeroDay. You have lots of other nodes. The black colored nodes may or may not be running Apache, and if they are running Apache, maybe they've been patched, as an example. Whereas in the past, you see the diagram showing a lot more red dots. So you can imagine a situation where maybe, just by luck, you just happen to apply the most recent version of Apache, and so you're not vulnerable today, but you were then. Or perhaps you deinstalled Apache from that server, right? So you were vulnerable in the past, but not today. Now, why is that important? It's important because you can think of a use case where vulnerability management is feeding intelligence into your incident response program. Because those red dots that are there in the past, keep in mind, if this is a ZeroDay, although we know now that this is a vulnerability that exists, we didn't know that, let's say, 3 weeks ago. But maybe some of the bad, the bad guys, bad girls, the hackers might have known this information. And so it is possible that they use that information to attack us. And what this allows us to do is to say, well, if I were to only look at the present moment, I'd get some great information. But when I look at the past in combination with the present, what I know is there are other candidates that I might want to actually investigate to see if I'm already compromised. Even though I'm not vulnerable today, I used to be. So this is vulnerability intelligence. So that's sort of an idea of how we've evolved across time. Challenges. What are the challenges of vulnerability management? There's many challenges. I'm not listing all of the challenges. Too many vulnerabilities. So how do we prioritize them? And there are different ways. Where is my business value? We talked about that on the previous, one of the previous slides. Surveys have different surveys. Gartner had one, Poneman had one, and there's a few others out there. And pretty much all of them come forth and conclude similar findings as far as, so I don't know if you're aware of this, but 59% of organizations don't know where their business value resides within their network. Could they find out? They probably could. They'd have to spend money, but it's just interesting that 59% don't know. Not 60, 59. So you would think, well, no problem. Let's just use, business value as a dimension to prioritize their vulnerabilities. But if you don't know where your value is, you can't use that dimension, right? So imagine that was the only dimension, or let's say that's the dimension plus vulnerability severity. You're back to vulnerability severity only as far as prioritizing. So there's a lot of other dimensions that you could prioritize on, network segmentation, et cetera. But that's, my point is, business value is a very good one, but it's a challenge to actually find. Who owns the assets? I don't remember if I have a coming slide that's talking on this. I think I do, so I'm going to hold off on this story. But who owns the asset is it's a large challenge, and we're actually working with a client right now on an integration. The integration's complete, but we'll talk about that story in a second. But what my point is that the knowledge of who owns the asset is very important, because part of the process is assigning vulnerabilities out to the team for remediation. But imagine if you had, I'm making this up, a vulnerability that was critical, and even if it was on a very important asset, but you didn't know who that asset owner was. And so it took you several days to find it. So that's just one vulnerability, right? So that is a challenge. One of the other challenges we see is, and that impedes vulnerability management maturity, is organizations, especially large organizations, they'll have different departments, and I sort of alluded to this before, where they'll have IT security and IT operations, and they don't always mesh that well, right? So part of overcoming that challenge is teamwork, and also an importance, so executive management, if they're not that interested, or if it's not coming from the top, that doesn't help that challenge, I guess. That's my point. And then finally, on my slide, I have accuracy of past findings, or VM intelligence. And this plays into the use case that I just shared before, right? So I talked about one use case, which is that hypothetical zero-day, where you're interested in finding, or understanding what the past vulnerabilities are and why that's important. That was just one use case. There's many use cases, many different security use cases that hint or that point you to that same conclusion. And so that is a challenge. The challenge is, well, let's move on. I'll share it. So I actually give a talk specifically on this. And there is a challenge in vulnerability, I won't say scanning, I guess it's called management technologies, where the challenge is related to a specific scanning technology, which is unauthenticated remote scanning. There's different types of scanning technologies. There's agent-based scanning, right? So this is where, and I'm sort of cover this in a second, but I'm going to go over a little bit of the technologies used for scanning to kind of set the stage. So with agent-based scanning, this is where you're going to have to deploy a program, an agent, onto the different endpoints that you want to assess. Now, once the program's deployed, that program actually will run and scan, quote unquote, for your vulnerabilities, your weaknesses, etc. Now it's on the computer, so of course it should be pretty accurate. So that's agent-based. But the challenge there is it's very difficult. It's not difficult to deploy, but it's costly, right? So you can't necessarily deploy an agent on every box. I mean, are you going to deploy one on your routers? And so, and then Linux nodes, deploying agents on Linux nodes could be a little challenge. You need to have SSH running, etc. not necessarily, but still, it is a challenge to do that. So that's agent-based. The other technology that's used is unauthenticated remote network scanning, and that is where you have your scanning engine. I'm going to pretend that this is a scanner here that's resident on a box, and it's sending messages out over the internet, internal or external, depending upon what kind of assessment you want to do, to the various endpoints that it's assessing. And then based upon the responses of those endpoints, right, so you'll have a set of vulnerability tests or a set of tests that you're performing, and each of those tests may send and receive a set of messages, and then you're going to draw conclusions. So that's remote. That's why there's a remote there. Unauthenticated. It's unauthenticated because it didn't authenticate to the node, if that makes sense. And then there's a kind of a combination of the two where you have credential-based, which is the solution is, the scanning solution is actually remote. It's resident on a remote device, but it would then authenticate to the node as opposed to just sending it unauthenticated messages. It'll authenticate over some protocol, and once it's authenticated with username, password, or whatever, it then will interact with the device and say, hey, give me your files, hey, give me your registry keys, etc. And then based on that data, can draw very detailed conclusions on weaknesses. But credential-based has challenges as well because you can't do it necessarily for all devices. Maybe for Windows devices it's not too bad, but then for Linux devices you have to install or at least run, for example, SSH or some kind of encrypted kind of communication technology that allows you to authenticate. So there's challenges, or what I want to say, or what I normally communicate is there's IT overhead with these other solutions. So all vendors out there actually provide a different types of combination of technologies, but they always include remote unauthenticated network scanning as part of their arsenal, if you will. And clients, typically what we'll do, us clients, people who are working in enterprises, we will use unauthenticated network-based scanning. By and large, that's the technique we're using most of the time. We're scanning across our entire network. We're doing it at a regular interval, weekly or bi-weekly, sometimes monthly, certainly more than yearly, like what we used to do. And then if we do know where our business value is, we'll use maybe agent-based scanning or authenticated scanning to sort of get a little bit more detail on the weaknesses of those devices and surrounding devices. But again, by and large, organizations will use the remote unauthenticated network scanning technology. And that comes with a challenge, it's a challenge. And that challenge is, and I've illustrated this here. So this is kind of cool. The lower part of the diagram here is showing us what I call the real world assets. These are, the computers that you can touch. So let's say this little laptop here is my asset A, right? And pretending that this is another device, let's say this is my asset B. Well, what happens is, if you're looking at this diagram, you're seeing scan week 1 and scan week 2. And what I'm illustrating here is, when you're performing ongoing assessments in a recurring fashion, and it's important to do that because you want to understand, well, did I fix these vulnerabilities? Are there any new vulnerabilities that have emerged? So you're measuring your risk across time, right? The challenge is where the technology, the solution, the vendor the challenge that they need to overcome is the assumption that a lot of people make is that these endpoints are just magically matched up together and that there's no change. For example, you would agree with me that if you're considering laptops and you go to Starbucks, etc., you're going to get a different IP address maybe next time you come into your enterprise network because you're probably using DHCP, right, to get that IP address. So that makes sense. You would say, yeah, I get it. My IP address may change. But for my servers, they're probably not going to change that much, right? Well, think again. And so the challenge here is correlating the correct asset as it appears in one point in time to its correct counterpart at a different point in time. And so in this example, I'm showing where the red asset has experienced the change somewhere in between week 1 and week 2 to where now it's sitting at a different IP address, as an example. And imagine if that were a server, for example, right? So this is a challenge. And And if a vendor solution actually mismatched these two together and believed, oh, the red asset, there it is, by mistake, there's consequences to that. And the consequences, you can think, for example, if, to make things easy, if the red asset had completely disjoint vulnerabilities relative to, say, the yellow asset, in this case, this vulnerability management solution would declare the red asset as having all its vulnerabilities fixed, because the yellow one doesn't have the same types of vulnerabilities. So you have a lot of different types of problems that are difficult to actually see, especially when you have a very large network. And we see this from organizations that are coming, from different competitive vendors over to us, because we actually solved this problem, as you probably already imagined. All right. So this goes along with the previous slide and the challenge that we're relating. So this is a technology challenge, right? It's not a people challenge. So vulnerability management maturity, as you saw, as we evolve across time, we need to look at past data, not just present data. And we need to be able to correlate past endpoints to current endpoints. And so I did a study in late 2014, and I wanted to understand, well, how often do endpoints or hosts of different types, client endpoints, right, so laptops, desktops, servers, database servers, web servers, printers, how often do those characteristics change across time? And what I did is I looked across, I said, look, let me look at my study was actually across 1 year, but I looked at 3-month intervals. And I wanted to understand, well, how often do, for example, servers have their IP address change, or their NetBIOS host name change, or their DNS host name change? So if I had, for example, 1,000 servers in my enterprise, I would expect to see 4% of them change their IP address across a 3-month time period. Could be more, but it's at least that much. And then those other characteristics are there. The reason I list them is because one of the largest vendors, actually, vulnerability management, they use one of those 3 characteristics to actually solve this problem. And you have the choice, actually, to tell the system, well, which characteristic do I want to track on within a given IP address range? So you can go into the system and say, well, between IP address A and B, I want to use IP address for tracking, because it makes sense to me. Oh, but for C to D, I know I have DHCP there, so I can't do that. So I'll use NetBIOS hostname. So they'll give you a little bit of control, but if you don't even know about this problem or haven't read the documentation closely enough, you're probably not going to do anything. You're probably going to assume that the solution takes care of itself. And unfortunately for you, the default is going to be IP address tracking, and all of your client endpoints are going to be sort of off. And that's where you're going to start discovering, wow, there's something wrong with this. Then you'll read the documentation, and at least you'll know, okay, I got a little more control over it. But the problem is that the characteristics change far more frequently than our intuition would lead us to believe, per this study. And as a result, those vendors who use limited tracking algorithms, I want to say, are putting your enterprise at risk. So I have a complete talk on this subject alone, but definitely that is a challenge. Now this brings us to a big part of the presentation, which is I call it the VM cubed, the Vulnerability Management Maturity Model. Does this make sense so far? Are we getting it? Yeah? It's hard to see the slides? Ah, I see. Okay, well, I'm thinking that the reason I'm sharing this is because there's a little sort of source at the very bottom there, so this whole study is online. If you go to digitaldefense.com into the resources section, you'll find this paper there, and we're just touching on it here, so that's why I put the source there. And obviously, you're not going to see that source from way back there either. So I'm kind of mentioning, You can get a copy of these slides, by the way, at the end, okay? So just to let you know. But there are 6 levels of maturity. So this is sort of a diagram that shows a pyramid, I guess. Level 0 through level 5. We could have said level 1 through level 6, but anyway. And the lower levels represent those that have least maturity. So if you're just starting out with vulnerability management, you'll probably be in one of the lower levels. If you're a smaller organization, so one of the things I wanted to mention is you can achieve higher levels of maturation, and it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to spend a whole lot more money. Or another way to say it is, if you're a very large organization, you're going to have different challenges that you have to overcome as it relates to smaller organizations. So even though smaller organizations don't have maybe as much money to spend within this process, they don't have as many challenges either, or they have different challenges. So it's not because you're a large organization that you're going to be sort of at the top, if that makes sense. In fact, many of the larger organizations have several problems, and we'll talk about those in more detail as we go. The other thing I will mention is just because like level 5 is the highest level maturity, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to strive to get to that level of maturity, right? Because it's business driven, right? So it might actually cost you a certain amount of money to get to level 5. But if your risk threshold is such that all you need to do is get to level 3, then you're okay. And so one could argue, well, I'm really, really mature because I'm taking into consideration that business aspect of it. So from that perspective, you are mature, if that makes sense. So the vulnerability management model that we looked at has a surrounding and a business environment, I want to say, a surrounding business environment. We'll talk a little bit about that in a second. And also different stages, right? So setting the policy is a stage, discovering and prioritizing assets, assess, prioritize findings. We talked about this as we went through the presentation. Remediate and measure and report. On the business environment aspect, we've seen that organizations where they invest in security awareness training throughout their entire organization, where they have high buy-in from executive management, those are the organizations that will typically be able to get to higher levels of maturation. If you don't have that buy-in, you may be very smart, you may have a very good security team, but when it comes to actually working with other teams to get things done, you're impeded. And as a result, you can't reach those levels of maturity, and it's not your fault. Okay? Policy. So here's where you're going to set risk thresholds, and you may not even know what they are at first, but as you go forward in time and you're looking at what are the different vulnerabilities, where's my business value, etc., you're getting a pretty good idea, and you can make measurements on what your risk threshold is. You have to take into consideration the business side of your operations as well. We're going to jump a little bit because I think we're running low on time and I want to get to some questions here. Discover and prioritize assets. Right, so this is where I talked about the challenge of, well, where are my business assets and where's the business value? How do you do that? That's a challenge. A lot of organizations do or invest in data loss prevention, and data loss prevention often has the ability to find where the sensitive data is. So that's an idea, is to, if you could take that information and integrate it with your vulnerability management system, you're already a step ahead, if that makes sense, right? Obviously assess, there are many different types of assessments you can do. Types, depth, how deep do you go? Do you use authenticated scanning? Do you use agent-based scanning? Do you use remote unauthenticated? We talked a little bit about that. And then, of course, the frequency. Nowadays, vendors are actually touting the ability to do continuous scanning. And in many cases, that does make sense. I think they oversell it a little bit. You're not going to do continuous scanning across your entire board. And in most cases, continuous scanning makes more sense from an agent-based perspective, in my opinion, but I digress. Right, so prioritize findings. So this is a big one, right? How do you prioritize findings? There's different dimensions. Obviously, in the olden days, and we still do this, we prioritize on the vulnerability severity, obviously, But asset criticality, that's definitely up there. Organizations are starting to use threat intelligence, right? So what kinds of attacks are coming, at me? What kind of attacks are hitting the same vertical market as my own vertical market? That gives me more intelligence to understand where the attacker is going to come hit. And there's where I might want to focus more. And then attack path is another one. There's ways to actually see, well, how, based upon your network segmentation, I guess is what I want to say. So if you have very good segmentation, you're going to use that to prioritize your vulnerability, right? Your vulnerability management. If you have a very flat network, unfortunately, you can't use that as much. Remediate. This is a huge one, right? So who are the asset owners? And I was talking just before that I was going to share a little bit about a story. So we're working with a client right now on an integration with ServiceNow. So the integration between Digital Defense Frontline Vulnerability Manager, FVM, allows an organization to set certain criteria where when certain vulnerabilities are discovered, tickets are automatically open in the ServiceNow side. And that's a wonderful thing, right? As they're open, the integration actually, this is the ServiceNow side, looks at, well, who's the asset owner? Who could I assign this to? And most of the time, this organization does have an asset owner, but unfortunately, that asset owner is the operating system person. And in this organization, they have a situation where different assets will have different administrators. So for example, if there's a database running on the system, there will be a database administrator. If there's a web application running on it, there might be a web application administrator, et cetera. So they have multiple different owners for each of those assets. And so when the person who's receiving the vulnerability, who's the actual OS owner, and it's not a Windows patch, they're like, well, who do I send this to, right? So this is a big challenge, even for them right now. So this is not just vulnerability management from the perspective of vulnerability management technology. It's other areas that it touches, and in this case, it's that ticketing system where you could say it's the CMDB. And how do you, if you don't have the information in it, how do you get it there, right? So I digress. Measure and report, well, I think that's one of our last ones. So obviously every process, if you want to improve it, you have to measure it. Because if you don't measure it, you don't know where you're at. So that's all I'll say about that. The report that I shared that is accessible on our website gives you a very good examples of different measurements that you can use to measure your process. So I encourage you to take a look at that. This is one of my last slides, so that's cool. How can you supercharge your evolution, I guess is the best way to say it. What are some ideas to bring you towards a faster evolution that you would otherwise not be able to achieve? And from what we have seen, and there are different ways, but one of the best ways is to team up with someone who knows about vulnerability management. So if you could approach a service provider who's done vulnerability management as a service, for example, first of all, you don't have to necessarily worry about your staff moving around and getting used to the different technologies as far as vulnerability management, because you'll have a management team there. So we found that that is a very big advantage. Those clients that are using vulnerability management as a service are typically more mature clients as far as vulnerability management is concerned, if that makes sense. So that's all I'll say on that. And wrap up. So vulnerability management's an evolving process. A lot of different challenges in vulnerability management. I mean, there's some that are certainly not even in that report that I mentioned, and it evolves across time, so that'll change, and that's normal. But the top ones that we found are scan-to-scan endpoint correlation. We talked about that technology where you actually have one point in time scan, and the vendors have challenges and actually relating it to the different points in time. That's very serious. There's certain situations where we see competitors. When I look at, and I've done a pretty deep study on this, when you look at competitors' customer service portals, which are actually accessible on the internet, which is kind of strange because as a competitor, I can actually go look at, for example, Qualys's customer portal or Rapid7 or whatever, and I can see all these different problems, and I'm relating them back to that scan-to-scan endpoint correlation limitation that I was referring to. It's not an easy problem to solve. We've solved it That's all I'll say about that. But anyway, prioritizing findings, definitely very important, but also challenging. Who are the asset owners? That's big in many organizations. Smaller organizations may not see that as much, but certainly larger ones will. Business communications, right? So we've seen, even with some of our clients, where they'll have the security team who's interacting with the different IT operations teams in order to do remediation, and they're not meshing well as far as communication goes. So this is sort of a business, organizational kind of challenge, not necessarily technological. We talked a little bit about the vulnerability management maturity model, and really the key message there is higher levels of maturity will typically mean lower risk, but you don't necessarily have to reach the top level. It really depends on your risk threshold. So it's a business decision. We talked a little bit about accelerating your vulnerability management evolution. Certainly if you read this report on VM3 or VM cubed, it'll give you some really good ideas, and it'll educate you more on the vulnerability management process, so that certainly will help accelerate it. But again, another way to do so is to team up with a vulnerability management vendor or service provider who will help you understand that process and sort of guide you through it. Questions? Yes, absolutely. There we go. And we came up with these, as we were going through this with all the different levels, we were like, let's give these levels names. And they're pretty okay, I guess. I'm laughing because a lot of it was marketing, Importance acknowledged for the first level. And it's true, it's not like, go ahead. Yes. That's a great question. And I mean, I'll be honest with you, in the first pass of the study, we want to do that, I guess is the best way to answer your question. And we have pretty good ideas, but we haven't put anything in stone yet that says, okay, if you're level 5, you need this, 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 and this. We did it at a high level, I guess, is to answer your question. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for coming. I'll be here all week. Well, actually, I'll be here tomorrow, so appreciate it. Thanks so much.